My name is Daria and I will talk about the research I've done in last year about death cafes in Russia. Firstly I should talk about what death cafe is. Basically, death cafe is a non-profit social franchise or social movement which was founded by British web designer John Underwood, this guy on the slide, in 2011. Basically, it is an event. It's not a place, it's an event where strangers gather to eat cake, drink tea, and discuss death. According to the website, the main objective, the main goal of the Death Cafe is to increase awareness of death with the view of helping people to make the most of their lives. It's important to know that death cafes are not therapeutically oriented meetings, so they do not say that they're therapeutically good in a medical way, but they do not provide bereavement counseling, they do not provide grief care, but still many people think that they work like some sort of therapy. So the popularity of Death Cafe has skyrocketed since it first appeared in 2011. As of now, on December 2019, there were 9,852 Death Cafes hosted in 68 countries all around the world. Death Cafes came to Russia in 2016, now there are regular Death Cafes in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Rostov-on-Don, Voronezh, Yekaterinburg, and some other cities. Here on the map there are not all the cities where Death Cafes are. So let's now talk about a little bit of theory. So Jack Fong, the American sociologist, who is the author of this book, the only one monograph about death cafes in the world. He observed American death cafes, and he used Habermas's theory of communicative action. He also added concepts by Erich Fromm, Kurt Wolff, and Ray Oldenburg, and he tried to make visible how death cafe participants bring concepts by Habermas to life. What he did, he observed 7 death cafes in California in 2014 and 2015. He was focusing on Habermasian communicative action happening on death cafes, and he used the method of tag cloud. I will show what it is, to see what are the most frequently used words. So it works like this: the bigger the word is, the more frequent it is used by the participant, by the attendee, and the smaller it is, so it is used more rarely. After doing that, he highlighted the most frequent themes that are spoken on Death Cafe and divided them by discourses. For example, theoretical discourse, moral discourse, and etc. He analyzed what themes provoke the highest number of discourse responses, both affirming and contesting, and finally he believes that Death Cafe is what he calls decolonizing the life world of death by confrontation with death. He also shows believes how Death Cafes make abrasive Habermasian concepts during their communicative exchange on the Death Cafe. He came to the conclusion that death talk allows many attendees, Death Cafe attendees, to find happiness and in the aftermath of confronting death, and it also raises their awareness and appreciation of shared humanity. He also notes that Death Cafe is a community building movement, so where people can really engage in a deinstitutionalized death talk and feel what he calls a visceral sense of community solidarity. So during my research on death cafes, I noticed both similarities and differences in between Russian experience and American experience. So what I did was I observed 7 death cafes in Moscow last year. I interviewed facilitators, so the ones who organize death cafes, of 4 death cafes in Russia, both in Moscow and in regions. I conducted a comparative analysis of American and Russian death cafe. I also analyzed media coverage of this phenomenon, and I also analyzed social media. So I was looking for practices that are performed on death cafes, and I also was looking for communication, for talks, for what is being spoken about on death cafes, and also the ways how practices and communication is connected. So here I will present some preliminary results of my research. So I will. Is it?
Press
F5?
F5?
No.
And no press space 4 times.
It will be too big for the screen.
Oh.
Okay, sorry, 1 second. Okay, it's I will say it like this.
Russian translation.
Yeah. So I will focus mostly on differences that I noticed during comparing Russian and American death cafes. I will pay my attention on 3 major observations made by Jack Fong, the author of this monograph. So the first one is that the vast majority of death cafe attendees are baby boomers, so the people who were born in the after-war period, so in between 1946 and 1964. The second one is that death cafes are primarily third places and public sphere phenomena. And the third one is that death cafes are inclusive spaces, and they guarantee elimination of status, any status inside of death cafe. So let's move on to the first one. So Fong states that 92.5% of attendees on death cafes he observed are baby boomers, so they are older than 60. And the rest, 7.5%, is Generation X. So he connects it with the conditions they grew up in, and he says that baby boomers are no strangers to anti-systemic struggles because they witness civil rights struggles, and they can make important demands upon healthcare system. He says that they tend to show more civil and political engagement. They also are very conscious of their rights, especially the right of public talk, which is connected with the death cafe. And they also believe that they have a right to deinstitutionalize their death talk, what is being done actually on death cafes. So in Russia, there is quite another story. So young people from 18 to 40 are more prone to attending death cafes, and averagely only 20% of attendees were older than 50. So it may also be connected with Fong's observation about that baby boomers grew up in conditions that made them very politically aware and aware of their rights, and the USSR policies at that time were not capable of nurturing people who are sensitive towards civil rights. And actually there were no massive civil rights movements at that time. So that may be an answer why more youngsters, why less people who are older come to death cafes in Russia. So let's consider statement number 2, that death cafes are third places in public sphere phenomena. Fong argues that they're very clear example of public sphere in third place. In the understanding of Oldenburg. It is interesting that although death cafes fit into the most criteria of the public sphere, they do not actually address the main criteria, which is the public sphere is always a politicized sphere. So in public sphere, critical talk about power, about politics happens, and but death cafes do not allow actually political opinions. They are not welcomed on death cafe. But Fong also states that death cafes have the potential to become politicized events in the future, which is also curious. Concerning third places, Fong comes to the conclusion that we can call death cafes third places because they provide people with informal and public at the same time environment, and they also work like an organ of civil society. So, for example, just as what is usually called third places, anti-cafes, bookstores, libraries, and having analyzed the criteria that Oldenburg suggests in his work about third place, I realized that although in principle they may be the example of third places, but in reality they do not address some of their criteria. Mainly, they do not guarantee the total elimination of status inside the death cafe. I will consider this point a little bit later. It is also important that the also a very crucial criteria of the third place, the accessibility of them, is also not addressed, because like third places should be really easy to get to and should be available 24/7. So anytime you can come to there and find some very nice company and communicate with them. But Death Cafe, it's very important that Death Cafe is not a place, it's an event for which you have to plan your time, register before the deadline on some Death Cafes, get to the venue, which in big cities just like Moscow is quite hard, and spend regulated amount of time once in a month or in a week, or yeah. So in this respect, if we really consider Death Cafe as a third place, they are more akin to the public lecture type of third place, and not an anti-cafe type, because usually anti-cafes are compared with death cafes. So the facilitator of one of the regional death cafes also noticed that in the interview I made with her, is that while public events such as like lectures, discussions are a commonplace in Moscow, in region it's not quite the same, and they do not have this public lecture culture. So that's why she thinks that it's one of the reasons why Death Cafe was so hard to implement in Rostov. So it's also an interesting point that we should maybe it's a problem of the third places in Russia as a whole. So it is really interesting, this a story told to me by one of the facilitators about that it was hard to, actually all the facilitators told me similar stories, but it was quite hard to find a suitable venue for death cafes at first. And for example, in Rostov, they rented a place in the mall, in some sort of small mall, and and the director of that mall rejected them and said that he does not want Death Cafe. He thought that it's like a cafe, a restaurant connected with death, and he said that he does not want to be connected with something related to death. So it's quite a common place in Russian. Yeah, so it's a question of the third place as a whole, because it's quite, in Russia, it's quite a young phenomena, and we cannot say that they are developed, and they are now developing. And it may be not even the problem with death theme in the public culture, but it may be the problem of really existence or absence of public sphere and third place concept in Russia. So let's consider the third statement. Death Cafe rules do not allow death talk from the position of an expert. It is stated in the rules on the website. The total deletion of any status is guaranteed on death cafes, which means that even if you're a funeral director or anyone, when you come to death cafe, you are not allowed to speak from your professional self. And Fong claims that during the death cafes he observed, only few participants disclose their occupation or convey their class status. So almost no one knew anything about the person in front of him, besides the root information such as name, age, or gender. And before one started sharing his death-related individual experience. This principle is stated even in the rules of Death Cafe, on the Death Cafe website. It is at a Death Cafe, people, often strangers, gather to eat cake, drink tea, and discuss death. In Fong's analysis of 7 Death Cafes, almost no one from the participants, no one knew each other. So in Russia, it's not quite the same. Even though Death Cafe is stated to be a social franchise, so affiliated Death Cafes should follow the same rules as the initial Death Cafe. And every facilitator signs it before he starts hosting it. It differs, in reality, it differs quite a lot. For example, in Moscow, during my interview with different facilitators, they all made visible that there is a huge problem on Death Cafe, that the presence of the constant presence of the professional community on Death Cafe, professional death-related community. So it turned out to be a very interesting point I want to talk about a little bit. When I started observing Death Cafe myself, I realized that this is quite true, because there were many people who were not strangers, but who were really friends to each other, and almost all of them are professionally engaged in death industry. For example, funeral directors, again, cancer counselors, doctors, especially ones who often connect with death, for example, oncologists, hospice workers, cryonic specialists, and so on. On some occasions, I've observed they occupied almost a half of the Death Cafe participants. All of the facilitators I've interviewed agree that it's not a positive trend at all. Death Cafe should be an inclusive space for ordinary people who want to talk about death from the position of their individual experience. Death Cafe in Moscow has become a place to gather people who share the same interests professionally, so not only individually. As the work one has always influences his life, and it inevitably influences the stories and narrations they tell on Death Cafes. For example, a woman who is a cancer counselor tells a story about her patient and the hardships she faced when this patient died. And funeral director shares these stories about curious funeral cases. Professionals on Death Cafes sometimes even accentuate their occupation. For example, one woman said, "Actually, I'm a hospice worker. That's why I've shared a story about the patient I felt the most connection with, and I was broken when he died." Sometimes the questions which are allowed to ask on Death Cafes, why not, are addressed directly to professionals. For example, some people say on Death Cafe, "I want to ask psychologists or oncologists who are present here It is usually frowned upon by death cafe facilitators, and the facilitator politely restates that there are no experts on death cafes and we are all equal in the face when we are standing in the face of our death. So this professionally oriented death cafe tendency can possibly be interpreted as accumulation of symbolic capital described by Pierre Bourdieu. Professional community which attends death cafes on a regular basis inevitably uses their experience in that industry in order to gain some status of an expert or to gain prestige. And one of the main characteristics of symbolic capital is that it helps you to accumulate to generate the web of allies, friends, and all in all what we call usable acquaintances. A person who comes to death cafe and works, for example, I don't know, in hospice, may not even realize or admit that he's doing that. And in this rhetoric we can go as far as we can also interpret the presence of professional community on death cafes in intention to understand the people they work with, their, I don't want to say the word clients, but okay, clients better, through informal death talk, which actually happens on death cafes. So death cafe in Russia do not only provide a venue where people with different statuses can interact, but also a venue for accumulation of symbolic capital and the professional exchange, not individual, but professional exchange. Facilitators who experience such a trend, as I have already said, describe it as a negative. So, for example, the facilitator of one regional death cafe said to me, station, sometimes just professional debate starts, sorry. We start to tautologize. I don't know why my colleagues, she's a former hospice worker, come to death cafes occupying vacant places. Maybe we should make a death cafe for professionals, but it's not quite a death cafe, so it's quite a hard dilemma because death cafe is it's not for professionals. So another interesting thing about the facilitators in Russia is that the vast majority of them have or had previously had job connected with death and dying, and so they're usually psycho-oncologists, they're hospice workers, etc. And some of them, many of them, admit that it's rather vice than virtue, and so co-facilitator of one regional death cafe admits that she has to turn her inner psychologist off during the meetings because this professional hazard in this case cannot be dismissed. So having observed these tendencies, it's hard to actually call death cafes now a global movement. Each death cafe differs from another because people who make it and people who attend it are very, very different, have very different backgrounds. I think that professional takeover happens not only in Russia, but Moscow death cafe is the clear example how death-related community occupies the space initially intended to deinstitutionalize and deprofessionalize death talk. So for now, Death Cafe in Moscow turned out to operate as a place of informal communicative exchange of professional community. But it's also important to know that it's always changing, that it's a very fast and a very dynamical change, and death cafes in Russia are very quite a novel phenomenon, and that's why I want to trace the dynamics of not only death cafes in Russia, but the public sphere in Russia as a whole. That's it, thank you.
Thank you, Daria. Maybe some questions from colleagues. Julia, let's start with.
That was really interesting. One of the discussion always starts by saying these are inclusive spaces. I would probably argue they're very middle class spaces. at the beginning. And in Russia, they're even more kind of professionalised spaces. Are there senses in which death cafes work to gentrify death culture? To gentrify, to change this whole death discourse into a middle class discourse?
Well, death cafes are a very, politically, it's, I don't know how to say it, but it's a very, it's the idea of actually human rights as a whole, because actually we have no places in in public sphere where we cannot come to the usual ordinary cafe and say, okay, let's now talk about death. So they actually, as an idea, they provide people with this space, but in Russia it does not work like this. So it's actually I did not study death cafes. For example, they exist in Afghanistan, they exist in United Arab Emirates, so they exist in China, in Japan, and it is very interesting how different. I think it differs with the culture they are implemented in, because they cannot always be the same. It's different countries.
Daria, want to say that in Russia, maybe how I understand you, how I know your beautiful paper, that in Russia, when we try to speak about this, we not speak really about this, but we speak about human rights, about human subjectivity, and so on and so on. So it is a very comfortable way in Russia to speak about real politics, about public politics, but in the way of that. So death cafes are places where you can speak about. So of course it's not just only about the middle class, but about the political activists in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, and so on. Yep.
It is first time when I heard about this kind of cafes, and I'm really interested to understand how does it look like, and what kind of discourse on death they suggest, whether, I don't know, not only with the particular talks, but what can you see in these places, and is there any place, is it very serious talk, or there is some place for irony or something else?
It actually looks like in Russia, it's a table with
No vodka.
With tea, with coffee, with different sweets, and people gather, they gather around the table, and they just discuss death in the means that death is important for them. They do not suggest any discourse. They do not say that we are all death positive, 100%. It's like it's a very. I cannot divide this discussions on death serious and not serious, because what is serious for one person is not serious for another person. But it's usually sometimes there are existential problems being discussed, is it possible to actually perceive death, because we cannot say that death exists, because when death comes, we do not exist, and this paradox, a very old one. But sometimes they just discuss the death of pets. For example, people come and say, my dog died and I don't know how to speak about it, I do not know what to feel about it. So it's very, very different. So there are different opinions presented on death cafes. For example, there are sometimes people who believe that sometimes there are religious people, sometimes there are transhumanists who believe that we should all be we should all use cryonics. I don't know how to say it. Yeah, so it's a very different thing. You can find videos on the YouTube. There are videos of death cafes.
Thank you very much for your paper. I have sort of preliminary comments about your preliminary conclusions. And first of all, about the symbolic capital thing. So it's interesting that you draw on accumulation of symbolic capital in that particular interaction. But on the other hand, I'm thinking maybe those people just lack a space of discussing the issues that they have in their professional career, and they need that space, and then they are kind of drawn into using their symbolic capital because they're seen as experts by others, although they don't really want to be experts, but they have to, since they work in those institutions, right? And so while you sound like they come there to kind of reaffirm their status, they actually come for something else, maybe. So this is one idea. And the other one, also quite preliminary, is about this, I don't know, sort of relationship between Russia and exports of anything into Russia, anything foreign. You didn't discuss it at all, but maybe it's an interesting issue in itself to yeah. I wonder how much time will pass until those death cafes will be designated suicidal, I don't know, groups that are supposed to be banned, and all the people will be drawn into prisons as soon as possible because it's a foreign influence and whatever thing the authorities may see in that. So, but it's not only about this political idea. It's also about what happens with the thing when it comes into new context, and what that thing, what form does that thing take in this new context, being taken from somewhere else.
I will continue with this later in my further research, but I also want to comment on what you said about that it's like suicidal groups. Some facilitators said to me that when she started making Death Cafe in Russia, the people, libraries, different places did not give her value for that, and she connects it with at that time in 2015, 2016, it was like a very burning issue, the suicidal groups in social media, and people could confuse like death cafes and suicidal groups, and could think that people who come to death cafes are like nearly suicidal, and they will be like pressed to so it already happened, but not on the scale of like state or nation.
Any questions? Thank you, Daria.